They say the devil is in the details. But if you were an engineer at Pratt Whitney in the summer of '39, you knew that was a lie. The devil didn't live in the details. He lived inside the combustion chamber of an experimental radial engine, screaming at 2,500 RPM. Heat. That was the enemy. Imagine sitting inside a steel cage with a wild animal that is actively trying to kill you. That's what the test block felt like. The air smelled of burnt castor oil, ozone, and bad coffee. The floor vibrated hard enough to rattle the fillings in your teeth. And in the center of it all hung the beast. The prototype R-2800. 18 cylinders arranged in two massive circles, like a double-fisted punch of aluminum and steel. Axe Sterling stood behind the thick safety glass. His white shirt was stained with grease and soaked through with sweat. He wasn't looking at the engine. He was staring at the needles dancing on the instrument panel. Oil temperature, red line. Cylinder head temp, 500 degrees and climbing. Jack pressed the talk button. His voice was calm, the kind of calm a man has right before a bar fight. "Hold it there, Eddie. Don't throttle back. Let her eat." Through the speaker, the voice of Eddie, his head mechanic, crackled with static and fear. "She's glowing, Jack. Cylinder 4 is cherry red. She's gonna blow." Jack didn't blink. He didn't care about safety regulations. He cared about winning. If they were going to put American boys in the sky to fight the Axis powers, they couldn't fly machines that were afraid of a little heat. "Push it," Jack commanded. "Full war emergency power. Now." The engine roar deepened, shifting from a mechanical scream to a guttural, earth-shaking howl. For 10 seconds, it was the most beautiful sound in the world. It sounded like pure American horsepower. And then, it sounded like a shotgun blast inside a trash can. Boom. A blinding flash of orange fire erupted inside the test cell. A piston rod, forged from the toughest steel in Pennsylvania, snapped like a dry twig and punched straight through the engine casing. Shrapnel slammed against the safety glass, spider-webbing the view. Smoke, black, oily, and thick, instantly filled the room. Jack didn't flinch. He just watched the black smoke curl against the glass, defeated. He reached out and killed the fuel pump. The howling died, replaced by the hissing sound of cooling metal and the dripping of hot oil on concrete. Another failure. The third one this month. The silence that follows a blown engine is the heaviest silence on Earth. Jack wiped grease from his forehead with a rag, grabbed his clipboard, and walked out of the booth. He stepped onto the factory floor, hoping for a smoke break. But he didn't get one. Waiting for him, standing next to a pile of scrap metal, was General Miller. They called him Bull Miller for a reason. He was a square-jawed man who looked like he chewed rivets for breakfast. He wore his army uniform like armor, and right now, he was looking at Jack like he was a stain on a dress shoe. That sounded expensive, Sterling. Jack tossed the dirty rag onto a workbench. "It's called R&D, General. Sometimes you gotta break things to make them stronger." Miller kicked a piece of twisted aluminum on the floor. "You're not breaking things, Jack. You're burning money. Uncle Sam's money. I just got off the horn with Washington. They're in love with the British engines, the Rolls-Royce Merlin. It's sleek, it's aerodynamic, and you know why? Because it uses liquid cooling. A radiator. Like a Cadillac." Jack felt his blood pressure rising. This was the same argument they'd been having for a year. "Liquid cooling is a liability, General. It's plumbing." "Plumbing works, Sterling!" Miller barked, his voice echoing off the high steel rafters. Jack stepped closer, invading the General's personal space. "Plumbing works in a Ford Model T, General. But at 20,000 feet, when a Japanese Zero puts a single 7.7 millimeter slug through your radiator, do you know what happens? You lose your coolant. Your engine seizes up in 30 seconds. And your pilot? He's either bailing out over the Pacific or he's riding a burning coffin all the way down to the water." Jack pointed a greasy finger back at the smoking test room. "Air doesn't leak, General. You can shoot a hole in an air-cooled cylinder and it keeps running. It keeps fighting. It brings the pilot home. That is why I am building this radial engine. Not because it's pretty, but because it's tough." Miller stared at him, eyes narrowing. He knew Jack was a genius. He also knew Jack was a royal pain in the ass. The General pulled a cigar from his pocket but didn't light it. "You talk a good game, Sterling. But right now, all you have is a pile of junk that overheats in 3 minutes. The Navy is getting restless." Miller leaned in, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I'm giving you 6 weeks. Fix the cooling issue. Figure out how to get 2,000 horses without melting the damn thing down. If you blow up one more test block, I'm pulling the plug. We'll buy liquid-cooled engines, and you can go back to fixing tractors in Ohio." Miller turned on his heel and marched out, his boots clacking rhythmically on the concrete floor. Jack stood there alone. 6 weeks. It was impossible. The laws of thermodynamics said it was impossible to cool an engine that massive with just air. The surface area of the cooling fins wasn't enough. The casting molds couldn't handle it. Eddie, the old mechanic, walked up quietly, holding a mug of black coffee. 6 weeks, huh? Eddie said, looking at the door. "We're dead in the water, Jack. We can't cast the fins any thinner. The sand molds crumble. It's a dead end." Jack took a sip of the bitter coffee. He looked at the shattered remains of his engine. He looked at the crude, thick cooling fins on the broken cylinder head. They were clumsy, blunt. Then, his eyes landed on his safety razor sitting on the workbench. The blade was thin, impossibly thin, sharp, precise. "We're not dead, Eddie," Jack said softly. Eddie looked at him, confused. "We're not?" "No." Jack's eyes locked onto the razor blade, a dangerous spark lighting up in his pupils. "We've been asking the wrong question. We've been asking how to cast better aluminum. But what if we don't cast it?" Jack turned to Eddie, a smile creeping across his face. The smile of a man who just realized he has nothing left to lose. "Get the boys, Eddie. We're going to need a hell of a lot of coffee. And we're going to need the sharpest tools in the shop. We're going to do something that's never been done before. We're going to carve this engine out of solid rock." There is a very fine line between a visionary genius and a total lunatic, and usually, that line runs right through a machine shop at 3 in the morning. The Pratt Whitney factory floor was empty. The thousands of workers had gone home to their families, leaving the cavernous building silent, save for the hum of the overhead lights and the scratching of a pencil on paper. Jack Sterling wasn't going home. He was hunched over a drafting table, his tie undone, sketching furiously. Next to him sat a solid 70-pound block of forged aluminum. It looked like a silver brick. Eddie, the old master mechanic, leaned against a support column, nursing his 5th cup of coffee. He looked at the drawing Jack pushed toward him, and he actually laughed. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was the laugh of a man who had seen everything and knew this was a pipe dream. "You're kidding me, right, Jack?" Eddie asked, tapping a grease-stained finger on the paper. "You want to machine the cooling fins? You want to cut them out? Do you have any idea how long that takes?" Jack didn't look up. "It's the only way, Eddie. Casting is too porous. It's weak. If we forge a solid block, the metal grain is tight. It's strong. Then we cut the grooves deep. We increase the surface area by 300%. Eddie shook his head, walking over to the lathe. He patted the cold steel of the machine like it was a loyal dog. "Jack, listen to me. To get the cooling you need, those fins have to be spaced 1/8 of an inch apart, and they have to be deep. You stick a cutting tool in that deep, it's going to vibrate. It's going to chatter. And then, ping, your fins snap off. It's physically impossible with the tools we have." Jack walked over to the lathe. He picked up a high-speed steel cutting bit. He held it up to the light. "Then we make new tools." "We don't have time to order custom tooling from Chicago," Eddie argued, his voice echoing in the empty shop. "I didn't say order them," Jack said, looking Eddie dead in the eye. "I said make them. Tonight. Right here." For a long moment, the two men just stared at each other. The engineer with the wild idea, and the mechanic with the calloused hands who had to build it. This was the heart of American industry right here. The friction between theory and reality. Finally, Eddie sighed. He threw his coffee cup into a trash bin. He grabbed a grinding wheel. "If I ruin this lathe, Jack, you're explaining it to the general." "Deal." For the next 4 hours, the shop sounded like a torture chamber for robots. The screech of the grinding wheel against hardened steel was deafening. Sparks flew in high orange arcs, illuminating the dark corners of the factory. They were grinding a custom cutting blade, thin, long, and incredibly sharp. By 4 a.m. it was ready. They hoisted the 70-pound aluminum block onto the lathe. Jack locked it in. Eddie adjusted the custom tool bit, his hands steady as a surgeon's. "Okay," Eddie whispered. "Here goes nothing." He flipped the switch. The lathe spun up. Whirr. Jack stood close, safety glasses on. "Easy, Eddie. Feed it in slow. Don't let it bind." Eddie turned the hand wheel. The custom blade touched the spinning aluminum. Scree! A high-pitched shriek filled the air. Long, silver ribbons of aluminum swarf began to fly off the block like confetti. They curled around the tool, hot and sharp. "It's chattering," Eddie yelled over the noise. "The tool is vibrating." "Don't stop," Jack yelled back. "Increase the speed. Cut through the vibration." It was counterintuitive. Usually, if a machine shakes, you slow down. Jack was betting the farm on physics. That speed would stabilize the cut. Eddie gritted his teeth and cranked the speed dial. The lathe whined higher. The screaming noise smoothed out into a steady, aggressive hiss. The silver ribbons flew faster, piling up on the floor around their boots, shimmering like snow. 1 fin, 2 fins, 10 fins. The solid block of metal was being transformed. The deep, impossibly thin grooves were appearing, uniform and perfect. The surface area was massive. It looked less like an engine part and more like a piece of jewelry, or a weapon. Suddenly the sound changed. The cut was finished. Eddie hit the brake. Silence rushed back into the room. The two men leaned in. The cylinder head was hot to the touch, but it was perfect. The fins were razor thin, standing straight and tall. They hadn't snapped. Jack ran his thumb along the edge of the metal. It was sharp enough to cut skin. "It works," Jack whispered. "It actually works." Eddie wiped sweat and aluminum dust from his face. He looked at the single cylinder they had just made. Then he looked at the blueprints on the wall. "Jack," Eddie said, his voice grave, "this is just one cylinder. The R-2800 has 18 of these, and the Navy ordered 5,000 engines." Eddie did the math in his head and looked at Jack with a mix of awe and horror. "We just proved it's possible," Eddie said. "But we also just invented a nightmare. We're going to have to turn this entire factory into a pile of aluminum shavings to build these things." Jack smiled, a tired, dangerous grin. He picked up the shiny new cylinder. "Better a nightmare in the factory than a funeral in the sky, Eddie. Wake up the night shift foreman. We've got work to do." Inventing a miracle is the easy part. Building it 5,000 times in a row, that is what kills you. If you walked into the Pratt Whitney plant in late 1941, you wouldn't have recognized it as a place of business. It looked like a war zone. And in a way, it was. The air didn't smell like coffee anymore. It smelled of hot cutting fluid and ozone. The floor was slick with oil and buried under ankle-deep drifts of silver shavings. The aluminum snow from machining thousands of cylinder heads. The sound was the worst part. It wasn't a hum. It was a scream. Hundreds of lathes running at top speed, carving into solid metal, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Jack Sterling walked the catwalk above the assembly floor, looking down at his creation. He looked like a ghost. He hadn't slept in 2 days. His eyes were dark circles and his hands trembled slightly when he lit a cigarette. Below him, the men were braking. "Damn it!" A shout rose up from Station 4. Jack watched as a young machinist threw his wrench across the floor. A custom cutting tool had snapped inside a cylinder block, ruining a week's worth of work. Jack went down. He didn't yell. He just put a hand on the kid's shoulder. The boy was crying, not from sadness, but from sheer exhaustion-fueled rage. "It's too hard, Mr. Sterling," the kid stammered, wiping grease and tears from his face. "The tolerances are too tight. We can't hold them. We're just making scrap metal." Jack picked up the ruined cylinder. "Take a break, son. Go get some water." It was a stalemate. They had the design, but the sheer brutality of mass-producing the Double Wasp was crushing them. The machines were failing. The men were failing. General Miller's deadline was breathing down their necks like a hungry wolf. Then came Sunday morning, December 7th. The factory was running a skeleton crew. It was quiet, relatively speaking. Jack was in his office, staring at a blueprint that wouldn't resolve itself, when the door burst open. It was Eddie. He wasn't holding a tool. He was holding a portable radio, his face pale as a sheet of paper. "Jack, turn it up." Jack frowned. "I'm busy, Eddie." "Shut up and listen." Eddie slammed the radio onto the desk. Through the crackling speaker, a voice cut through the room. It wasn't the usual music program. It was a frantic news announcer. "Air raid on Pearl Harbor. This is not a drill. I repeat, the Japanese are attacking Pearl Harbor. Severe damage to the Pacific Fleet. Ships are burning in the harbor." Jack froze. The pencil dropped from his hand. For a moment, the world stopped turning. The arguments about cooling fins, oil pressure, and tolerances vanished. The engineering problem was gone. It had been replaced by a survival problem. Jack stood up. He walked out of his office and onto the factory balcony. He grabbed the microphone for the PA system. "Kill the power!" Jack roared. "Shut down the line, now!" The order echoed through the massive hall. One by one, the lathe spun down. The screeching metal went silent. The workers looked up, confused, dirty, and tired. Jack stood at the railing. He didn't look like an engineer anymore. He looked like a man who had just seen the future, and it was on fire. "Boys," Jack said, his voice booming over the speakers, "you can stop worrying about your paychecks. You can stop worrying about your shifts." He paused, looking at the sea of faces. Fathers, brothers, sons. The Japanese just bombed Pearl Harbor. Our fleet is burning. Our boys are dying in the water because they didn't have the air cover to protect them. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Men took off their caps. "Up until now," Jack continued, his voice hardening into steel, "we've been building an engine. We've been worried about overtime and sore backs. That ends today." Jack pointed a finger at the silent, half-finished engines on the assembly line. "That is not an engine anymore. That is a ticket home. Every cylinder you cut, every bolt you tighten, is the difference between an American pilot seeing his wife again or getting shot down over the Pacific." He leaned into the mic, his voice low and intense. "We aren't factory workers anymore. We are the first line of defense. If we fail, they fail. And I don't know about you, but I don't plan on failing." Jack let go of the mic button. Silence hung in the air for exactly 3 seconds. Then, without a word, the kid at Station 4, the one who had been crying an hour ago, walked back to his machine. He picked up his wrench. He clamped a new block of aluminum into the vise. He hit the green button. Wait. Then another machine started. Then another. Within moments, the factory was screaming again. But this time, the rhythm was different. It wasn't the sound of work. It was the sound of war. The sleeping giant had woken up, and it was angry. There are tests, and then there are inquisitions. What happened in test cell number 3 on a freezing Tuesday in 1942 wasn't science. It was an execution. The finished R-2800 Double Wasp hung in the center of the room. It didn't look like the prototype anymore. It was darker, denser. The machined cooling fins were so thin and so tightly packed that from a distance the cylinders looked like solid gray velvet. General Bull Miller stood next to Jack. The general wasn't yelling today. He was checking his wristwatch. "Here are the new Navy requirements, Sterling," Miller said, his voice flat. "They need to know this engine can survive a dogfight with a 0. They want a 60-minute run." Jack nodded. "Standard cruise power? We can do that all day." Miller shook his head. "No, not cruise. War emergency power, maximum boost, wet manifold, for 1 full hour." Jack felt the blood drain from his face. Eddie, standing at the control console, dropped his clipboard. "General," Jack said, keeping his voice steady, "war emergency power is designed for 5 minutes, maybe 10 if you're suicidal. It dumps fuel and water into the cylinders to stop them from detonating. If you run it for an hour, you'll melt the pistons." "The Japanese don't fight in 5-minute intervals, Jack," Miller said, looking at the engine. "If this thing blows up here, it costs me money. If it blows up over the Pacific, it costs me a pilot. Run it." Jack looked at Eddie. Eddie looked like he was about to be sick, but he nodded. "Clear the deck!" Jack yelled. "Fire in the hole!" The starter motor whined. The massive propeller jerked once, twice, and then the Double Wasp caught fire. Blue flames spat from the exhaust stacks. The sound was deafening, a deep, chest-thumping bass that you didn't just hear, you felt in your bone marrow. "Bring it up," Jack ordered. "Take it to the red line." The engine screamed. The needles on the gauges buried themselves in the danger zone. 2,000 horsepower. Enough energy to power a locomotive trapped inside a block of aluminum the size of a kitchen table. 15 minutes. The room was getting hot. The heat radiating from the engine was so intense it was blistering the paint on the walls. The engine was vibrating, straining against the mounts. It sounded angry. 30 minutes. The air in the control booth was thick with tension. Jack was sweating through his shirt. He watched the cylinder head temperature gauge. It was hovering right at the limit of structural failure. "She's drinking oil, Jack," Eddie yelled. "Pressure is dropping." "Let it drink," Jack yelled back. "As long as it has blood in its veins, keep it alive." 45 minutes. Something happened. A gasket on cylinder 9 gave way. A spray of hot oil hit the exhaust manifold. Whoosh! A flash of orange flame licked up the side of the engine. "Fire!" Eddie shouted, his hand reaching for the emergency kill switch. "Jack, we have a fire." Jack grabbed Eddie's wrist. His grip was like iron. "Don't you touch that switch!" Jack roared. "It's burning!" "Let it burn." Jack stared through the glass, his eyes reflecting the flames. If a pilot is at 20,000 feet and his engine catches fire, He can't pull over to the side of the road. He has to keep flying. We need to know if it holds." It was madness. The engine was enveloped in smoke and sporadic bursts of fire. It shook violently, rattling the safety glass. It sounded like a bucket of bolts in a blender. It sounded like it was dying. But it didn't stop. The machined fins, those razor-thin pieces of aluminum that Jack and Eddie had fought for, were doing their job. They were slicing through the air, shedding the hellish heat just fast enough to keep the metal from turning into liquid. 59 minutes. The roar was ragged now. The engine was tired. You could hear the exhaustion in the metal. "Come on," Jack whispered, his nose pressed against the glass. "Don't you quit on me now. One more minute." The second hand on the wall clock ticked. It felt like hours. Tick, tick, tick. 60 minutes. "Cut it!" Jack yelled. Eddie slammed the fuel cutoff. The engine gasped, sputtered, and finally fell silent. The propeller spun down to a halt. For a long time, nobody moved. The only sound was the tink-tink-tink of cooling metal contracting. The room was filled with blue smoke. General Miller walked up to the glass. He stared at the engine. It was blackened, oil-stained, and ugly as sin. "Well?" Miller asked. Jack walked out into the test cell. He ignored the heat. He walked right up to the engine and placed his hand on the cowling. It was still radiating waves of heat, but the block was intact. No cracks, no explosions. Jack turned back to the window and gave a thumbs up. Miller let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for an hour. He lit his cigar, the flame trembling slightly in his hand. "Pack it up, Sterling," Miller said, a rare grin breaking across his face. "Ship it to the Navy. Tell them the monster is ready to eat." 2 years later, 10,000 miles away, the sky over the Philippine Sea was a perfect, blinding blue. It was the kind of blue that looked innocent. But Lieutenant Mike "Tex" Conway knew better. In 1944, the sky wasn't a place. It was a hunting ground. Mike sat strapped into the cockpit of an F-6F Hellcat. In front of him was the result of Jack Sterling's sleepless nights, the production model R-2800 Double Wasp. It wasn't shiny anymore. It was covered in soot, salt spray, and the grime of war. It hummed with a low, steady vibration that traveled up through the stick and into Mike's hands. It felt heavy. It felt safe. "Bandits, 3 o'clock high." The radio chatter shattered the peace. Mike snapped his head right. 3 silver specks were diving out of the sun. Japanese Zeros. "Brake right! Brake right!" Mike kicked the rudder and slammed the throttle forward. The Double Wasp roared. It didn't hesitate. The massive propeller bit into the air, dragging the heavy fighter plane upward to meet the enemy. The next 3 minutes were a blur of G-forces and terror. The world spun. Tracers zipped past the canopy like angry hornets. Mike lined up a 0 in his sights. He squeezed the trigger. His .50 caliber machine guns tore the enemy wing apart. 1 down. But he got greedy. He didn't check his 6. Thud, thud, thud. The impact felt like someone hitting the plane with a sledgehammer. A 20mm cannon shell from a second 0 slammed into the Hellcat's nose. The windshield instantly coated in black oil. Smoke poured into the cockpit. "I'm hit!" Mike screamed into his mask. "I'm losing power!" He glanced at his instruments. It was a nightmare. Oil pressure was 0. Manifold pressure was erratic. He looked out the side window and saw the damage. The cowling was blown open. One of the cylinder heads had a hole in it the size of a fist. You could actually see the piston moving inside. In any other plane, in a Spitfire, in a P-51 Mustang with a liquid radiator, Mike would be a dead man. The coolant would have sprayed out, the engine would have seized in 30 seconds, and he would be swimming with the sharks. But this wasn't a liquid-cooled engine. This was American iron. The engine shook violently. It coughed. It spat fire. But it did not stop. Those razor-thin cooling fins, the ones Jack and Eddie had carved out of solid metal back in the silent factory, were shedding heat like a miracle. The wind rushed over the broken cylinder, keeping it just cool enough to keep pumping. The 0 circled back for the kill. The Japanese pilot probably expected the American plane to fall out of the sky. Mike gritted his teeth. "Come on, you ugly beast. Don't quit on me." He slammed the throttle to the firewall. The wounded engine responded with a defiant growl. The Hellcat surged forward, limping but fast, diving toward the cloud layer and the safety of the fleet. The engine chugged like a tractor. It banged and clattered. But it spun. For 20 agonizing minutes, it carried Mike Conway over the endless blue water. When the deck of the USS Enterprise came into view, Mike was weeping. not from fear, but from gratitude. He snagged the arrestor wire and slammed onto the deck. The engine sputtered once, sighed, and finally died. Mike unstrapped himself and climbed out onto the wing. He walked to the front of the plane. The deck crew gathered around, staring in disbelief. The engine was a wreck. It was shot to pieces. It had no oil. It was half melted. By all laws of physics, it should have exploded miles ago. Mike took off his glove and laid a hand on the scorching hot metal of the cowling. He patted it gently, like you would pat a loyal dog that just took a bullet for you. "Good boy," he whispered. "Good boy." Connecticut, USA, 3 weeks later. The factory was louder than ever. The war was turning, and the demand for engines was insatiable. Jack Sterling sat in his office, surrounded by mountains of paperwork. He looked older. His hair was grayer. Eddie walked in. He wasn't carrying a coffee this time. He was carrying a small wooden box. "Package from the Navy, Jack." Jack rubbed his eyes. "Parts return? Scrap metal?" "No, personal mail." Jack opened the box. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a jagged piece of aluminum. It was a single cooling fin, sheared off by a cannon shell. It was bent and scorched, but you could still see the machine marks, the distinct, precise grooves that Jack had insisted on. Underneath the metal shard was a letter. It was handwritten on wrinkled stationery. "Dear Mr. Sterling, they told me you're the man who designed the Double Wasp. I don't know much about engineering. I don't know about thermodynamics or tolerances. I'm just a pilot. 3 weeks ago, your engine took a 20mm shell to the block. It lost all its oil. It caught fire. It shook my teeth loose. But it brought me home to meet my newborn son. My mechanic said no other engine on Earth could have kept running. He said it was built like a tank. Thank you for being stubborn. Thank you for the air cooling. Lieutenant Mike Conway, USS Enterprise." Jack put the letter down. He picked up the piece of jagged metal. He ran his thumb over the sharp edge of the cooling fin. He remembered the night he and Eddie stood alone in the dark shop, grinding the tool bit, terrified of failure. He looked out the window at the factory floor. He saw the thousands of men and women, heads down, covered in grease, turning handles, cutting metal. They weren't just building machines. They were building lifeboats. Jack stood up. He walked over to the wall where the blueprints of the R-2800 hung. He didn't see lines and numbers anymore. He saw Mike Conway. He saw his son. He pinned the jagged piece of metal right in the center of the drawing. "Eddie," Jack said, his voice thick with emotion. "Yeah, Jack? Brew a fresh pot of coffee. We've got to make the next one even stronger." The Pratt Whitney R-2800 Double Wasp didn't just win battles. It became a legend. It proved that in the face of impossible odds, American grit, ingenuity, and a refusal to compromise could forge a heart of iron that even the fires of war could not stop.